2, 1, adelante.
Muy buenos días, gracias por acompañarnos el día de hoy en el Seminario de Migración, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas en el marco del proyecto de intersección de la política migratoria con la política exterior en el México de hoy. The event will be held in English, so welcome everyone. Feel free to put questions in Spanish if you feel feel better to do so. We are really happy to be here with a great panel of experts trying to think on how can we project migration at the turn of 2020. And when I say it's a great honor to have everyone here at Colmex, we have a great panel from all over the world with very different time zones. So we really appreciate and thank everyone to be here late at night and really early in the morning. So today's event is part of a discussion that we're having at Colmex, trying to understand migration policy and foreign policy. But we're really interested in understanding what will happen in the future and setting up different scenarios for migration. And so what better can we do in trying to understand different scenarios, trying to discuss with the experts that are actually in charge of projecting migration from different places. And even if we're interested in what's happening in Mexico and the region, we are also really interested in understanding migration within a global and international perspective. So that's why we're really happy to have here a discussion in terms of what happens worldwide. Let me start right away because we are a little bit late with the first round of presentations. So if you are listening to the event from YouTube, feel free to put the questions in the chat. If you are here joining us through WebEx, also put the questions in the chat, but please do it for everyone so I can see the questions that you're putting. And because we want this to be a very open discussion, feel free to put the questions as they come up. So we're gonna start first having Abel presenting a short discussion from his perspective. He's an applied statistician based at the Asian Demographic Research Institute. He's a professor in the School of Sociology and Political Science at Shanghai University. I'm sure you have seen the global migrant stock core diagrams that he has produced. And I think this is a great way to start trying to put in context the global flows and the migrant stock that we are seeing now. Just before we start, I see a microphone that's popping up, so I don't know if you could please everyone mute your microphones. Guy, please.
Okay, yeah, let me try and share my screen. Okay, is this one? Is that working? You can see my screen?
You can see your screen and your, yeah, that's good. If you can just mute.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, full screen. Okay, so yeah, I'll just try and give a brief overview in the 5 or 6 minutes of a recent paper that I did with Professor Joel Cohen. And we're really trying to look in this paper at global migration flow estimates. And hopefully it will provide a useful basis for a discussion later on migration data and projections. So much of my past research has been focused on developing plausible baseline data for global population projection models used at IASA in Vienna and the Wittgenstein data, where I was previously based. So population projection models of any type, global or not, require some kind of baseline data for future assumptions for migration. And the de facto sort of measure is a net migration measure. And it's can be problematic because one of the many weaknesses of a net migration measure that it's difficult to use to really empirically define any kind of policy relevant migration scenario that you want to put into a projection model. Since you've got one sort of very coarse measure of net migration for each country, and to really define a migration system just with that one measure for each country is pretty much near impossible. So fortunately, new methods to estimate global origin destination migration flows provide alternative measures beyond a net migration, gives a lot more detail. These estimation methods at the global level are sort of based on changes in origin destination migrant stock data for all countries that are published by UNDISA, pretty regularly updated, and sometimes by the World Bank. And these flow estimates, like I said, provide a much richer picture of migration patterns and trends, and can aid in developing base data and future scenarios for projections. Okay. So in the paper, we review 6 flow estimation methods, and in particular, we focused on 2 shortcomings that we found in the kind of small literature that is formed of these migration estimation methods. So in particular, we found that previous applications of the methods were based on different input data, which made it very difficult to sort of compare the estimates themselves and figure out why some estimates are higher or lower, for example. And also, the previous estimation methods papers, there was a limited amount of validation going on in comparing the flows against each other and also against official flow statistics in countries that produce the data, not available everywhere. So we had these 6 methods. We kind of categorized them into 3 broad groups: stock differencing group, which was mainly done by economists, this migration rates approach by Dennett, and also 3 different methods that were sort of based on demographic accounting approach, first proposed by myself in a paper in 2013. And what we did was take all these 6 methods and apply them to the UNDISA stock data. And I've updated that, in fact, for these, comes in 5-year intervals, which allow us to produce estimates, 6 estimates from the 6 methods of origin destination migration flows between 200 countries for these 6 5-year periods. So to give you a bit of an idea of the flows, how they look, so we had these country-to-country flows. This is an aggregated plot here of the sort of region-to-region flows in this chord diagram. So, for example, if you wanted to know how many migrants were estimated to move from Latin America and the Caribbean to North America, you could read that off as around about 5 million. These ticks are in millions of migrants estimated during this 5-year period. This is for the Swedish-Bayesian demographic accounting approach of Raftery and Jonathan, as I say. So this kind of gives you a lot bigger picture of the migration system. And if we forward it, we can sort of animate it through time and sort of see how it evolves. And so you can sort of pick out changes in migration patterns that are occurring over the 30-year period. For example, you see this big rise in the movements within West Asia. So that's the Syrian refugees in the penultimate period. And even here, you can see the Venezuelan flows right at the end. And overall, you see the sort of change in the total migration flows going up from around 17 million up to about 96 million. So the next plot, I've got just the same photos here from the Swedish-Bayesian demographic accounting approach, and the 6 other methods, just for a comparison. So you can see in general, global amount of flows estimated from all the methods sort of went down in the second half of the 90s, then rose, and then slowed down or even decreased. This is perhaps not the best method, but sort of shows some sort of change over time and perhaps a slowing. I would caution these last 2 estimates that they are going to be probably revised quite a big revisions might go on as more and more stock data comes out in 2022, and so the flow estimates will change correspondingly. On the right is just the what's on the left, the estimated flows divided by the global population. So you can sort of see the rate global migration, which tends to be fairly constant from all these methods. Okay, this is my sort of final slide, which just shows what we were doing in the second half of the paper, which is really taking the estimates from these 6 different methods and developing a set of validation exercises to compare what are the best estimates and from the six methods. And to do that, we use the correlation between the estimates and an aggregate of annual immigration and immigration flow data published by national statistics agencies. So these are different collections in these, at least the first 4 different boxes of these migration statistics for around 20 to 30 to 40 countries, depending on the collection, but mainly they're from kind of rich European Western countries. So some overlap in the data in each case. And for each of them, we calculate the correlations and looked at 6 different migration measures typically used, whether by economists in modeling or demographers in projections. And you can see in general, sort of most of the estimation methods do best at sort of estimating the immigration rates and the net migration counts, and not too good on the immigration rates. And the demographic accounting methods sort of tend to do a bit better than the others, especially the last one, the Swedish-Bayesian approach. You can see just I point out here that the comparison between the UN net migration, these 5-year migration that the UN publish, there's a perfect correlation for these last two methods, and that's I think a nice feature of those two methods. So I'll just leave you with a picture of the website when you go to the paper, and just that the estimates are all there, linked to the estimates, they're in a repository if you ever want to use them. the R code to get the estimates, and lots more details in there. Okay, so I'll leave it there. And I cancel my, well, there we go. Okay. Okay.
Thank you so much, Guy. I wanna highlight two things. First of all, that it's really interesting when you show the core diagrams, the evolution over time, but also the different regions, how Latin America is a small portion, right? And I think this is important to highlight because here when we're in Mexico, or I think this happens everywhere, people try to think that their own case is just the largest or the most important case. So I think it's really important to put things into perspective. And I just want to highlight also that something that we know is that different scenarios produce different estimates. And it's interesting that when you compare 200 countries, that you have very different results. So I guess this leads me to talk about uncertainty. And I was looking at Professor Jakub Bijak website, and it was really interesting that he has a quote that I will read. It says, "My research interests focus on the methods of statistical demography, in particular surrounding migration, which can help deal with the uncertainty of demographic phenomena." So I guess we are here, we all know that migration is the most uncertain dimension of demographic dynamics. And I'm really interested in understanding what he suggests for actually understanding this uncertainty. He's the joint head of the Department of Social Statistics and Demography and professor of statistical demography at the University of Southampton. So please, Jakub, if you can present. I hope you can share now the screen.
Thank you. I don't have the button yet, but I guess it's coming, right? Oh,
Okay,
yes, now I can do it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jakub.
Right, is it sharing okay?
It is fine.
Fantastic, thank you. So in my 5 minutes or so, I would like to talk a bit about the state of the art where we are with forecasting migration. So as you said, Claudia, this is probably the most tricky demographic thing to predict, and there are very compelling reasons for that. So in a sense, it becomes almost a truism to repeat it yet again, that migration, because it's purely driven by human decisions, human actions, has very high levels of uncertainty, and it's also complex because of all the drivers that are interacting in shaping the migration processes. So what we are looking at is processes that can be seen as, by and large, barely predictable, and statisticians will say very likely non-stationary. I think I'm echoing.
2 seconds. Let me interrupt. Frank, could you please turn off your microphone? Sorry for that interruption.
So the problem with forecasting is that if we try to make it too orderly or too nice looking, what we get is likely to miss the reality quite severely. But we know something. So we already, as Guy mentioned in his talk, right? We know that it's preferable to model individual flows or even subflows, flows for different groups of people, to sort of high-level aggregates such as net migration. So we know that, and we know that there's some stable patterns. We know that the age structures are pretty stable. We know that also the spatial patterns are quite persistent. And again, as Guy was showing in some of his slides, the changes in stocks are happening much more slowly, at a slower rate than changes to flow. So at least we know something. We know where to look for some more robust patterns when it comes to future migration. But still, the key challenges we have is how to describe the uncertainty correctly and how to calibrate it so that we make sure that the future uncertainty actually, the future uncertainty we come up with as modelers and forecasters represents the uncertainty of the process that will unfold. And whenever we are tempted to use some predictors, economic variables, demographic variables, we need to take into account the fact that they can be also problematic when it comes to their predictability. So some of the variables may be even worse predictable than migration, and some of them, like population size, migration is a very sort of interlinked endogenous relationship. So migration changes through population, but also population changes deterministically through migration. So this has to be taken into account. So why, if it's so difficult, why do we have to do it, right? Or why do we want to do it? And the answer will depend on what we're looking at. So there is a range of policy needs that trigger the demand for migration predictions at the different timescales. So there are the very short-term operational needs. If there is an asylum crisis, then there are very concrete humanitarian needs in terms of providing food and shelter and so on. And here what we can do is just count on some early warnings and detecting signals in the trends that we observe on the ground, ideally using some high frequency data. Then there are the planning needs, the longer term, the sort of medium horizon planning needs, where we need to employ some decision analysis taking into account the costs and benefits, for example, when it comes to school places for migrant children, or translation services and similar. And then there's sort of the long-term policy strategic needs that really look into scenario type approaches and stress testing and horizon planning, for horizon scanning for looking into the future of migration. And of course, for demographers, especially for demographers, there's one of the fundamental reasons to predict migration, or at least to try to predict migration, is that we want to predict population sizes and structures, and we can't do it without having to contend with migration in the first place. So what we know what we know, and we know what we don't know. And when it comes to the state of the art in the approaches that have been proposed for modeling and predicting migration, there's now a range of techniques, starting from the very short period, change point detection type approaches that can be used for early warnings, surveys that can be used for trying to find about migration intentions, bearing in mind that intentions do not necessarily mean migration reality. They're necessary but not as sufficient conditions. Then we have a time series model, hierarchical models, and then at the end of the day we have scenarios, ideally with some expert input into them. And different types of migration, different flows of migration, can have different levels of uncertainty and thus predictability. So what we can also do when it comes to policy or practical applications is to try to look at the migration flows through the lens of a risk management approach, where we try to map the different types of migration flows that we are looking at against the potential societal or policy impact that might have. So here is a stylized example based on a work that we did a few years ago for the UK, but the approach is much more general. So what it shows is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach for different types of migration flows. The different processes will have different characteristics, which, when it comes to uncertainty, and please note that I haven't included anything in the low uncertainty category, just because of the nature of migration being such that it would be really difficult to say that it's highly predictable. But at the same time, the different flows imply have different salience for the policy and policymakers and other decision makers. So the combination of the two can give us an idea about where to go with migration predictions and how can they be used. Also bearing in mind the limitations of the prediction horizons. And finally, the big caveat. We know the problems with predicting migration, but the equally important are the problems with the governance that is based on any migration predictions or any forward-looking attempts at making migration scenarios or similar approaches. So predictability is about forecast errors. This is clearly the realm of the black swans, one famous animal metaphor by Nassim Taleb. Right? If we can't predict it, and it can be quite consequential, that there's definitely a problem with the inherent uncertainty. But at the same time, when it comes to the policy world, there's there are quite a few problems that can come up as a result of complacency and failure to act upon predictions. So there is another metaphor that the Grey Rhino, Michelle Walker, proposed it in her 2018 book that speaks to that second problem about governance. So I think one message, especially in the context of our seminar today, is that when thinking about the future migration, we need to delineate, what is possible to predict and what are the limits of prediction versus what follows then, and how to make sure that the best predictions are actually acted upon by the decision makers. And I'll leave it there, just by saying that already the literature on migration predictions forecasting is quite broad and growing. This is a field that has been evolving quite rapidly in the last at least decade and a half, and there is more still coming up, including the work that's done by our project QuantMig and two other projects that are funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 umbrella. So if you're interested, please visit us on quantmig.eu to check out what we've been up to. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that really comprehensive presentation of the state of the art. And I think it's really, really important as you finish, like, it's really migration scenarios for better policy. So that's where we are now, I think, at least us ourselves here in Mexico. So trying to figure out how forecasting is actually could be related to better policy and governance of migration. Let me move to Adrian Raftery. He's the Boeing International Professor of Statistics and Sociology and a professor at the Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle. He has worked on many, many, many different subjects and areas. And so migration, I think, is one of the many interests that he has. And it's great to have him here. I'm not going to say way more about Adrian, except that because he has worked in many different areas, he has also won very different awards in very different areas. And I think it's important, I think, to have a perspective of migration within this very complex scenario. I'm wondering, Adrian, if I guess you're going to be talking about the Bayesian approach, and I think it would be really interesting if you could at some point explain to non-statisticians and mathematicians what exactly it means to include the past into the future. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you. Let's see, I'm having difficulty here with the
sharing. Héctor,
yeah.
¿puedes asegurarte de que esté?
So it says allow WebEx events to record your computer screen.
No, it should be the third button that says compartir or share next to.
Yeah, I've got that, but it's not. All that comes up is open. I should open system preferences, but I did to allow, it says allow WebEx events to record your computer screen so that you can share content. And there's no, I don't have a, so I don't know if
Héctor,
give me some guidance on that. Yeah, it is.
Yes, Héctor.
Sí.
¿Tienes alguna sugerencia? Dice que no puede compartir porque le sale un mensaje. De que le pide.
¿Estará usando Mac?
Are you using a Mac?
It's a Mac, yes.
Sí.
Debe conceder permisos localmente en su máquina para que pueda compartir el contenido.
Okay, so
acceso al disco.
Okay, so
yeah.
I think you should just say yes to the. Sorry.
I did.
You
I did, and I see it's clicked. It's clicked yes for Cisco WebEx events.
Do you wanna send it to me and I share very quickly? Or you can no. Or let me.
I don't like that. No, I don't, because I'm.
Yeah.
I'm bit by bit.
Can you, Héctor, ¿nos puedes decir por favor cómo cambiar los permisos?
It did say I should click out of Cisco WebEx and come back in to make the system's preferences operate. So maybe I should do that.
Wait.
You have to do it.
What?
Yeah, you have to do it. You have to exit.
I have to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. How do I exit?
It doesn't matter.
How do I exit here? Oh, I just click out. Is that? should I click out?
Victor, what does
Leave
we need to
event.
do?
Okay,
Because
I
it
leave
it
event.
happened to me too, so se tuvo que salir y va a tener que volver a entrar para
Okay,
que
so
vean las
let me
preferencias.
okay, let me go on and go with Helena Cruz Castanheira while he's back, and hopefully we'll figure that out. I'm really sorry for all these technical difficulties. Unless he comes very quickly, should that be very fast, Victor?
Yeah, yeah, it should.
Okay. Let's give like 10 seconds before I move to Helena.
Here we have it.
Hey, okay, you're there. Adrian, can we try to see if it works now? We can't hear you. Great. We can see your screen. I guess we all learned during the pandemic, we just need to be patient with technology and not desperate. We see your screen, but we don't see your presentation though. Great, that's there. Thank you, Adrian. Go on. I think we're good. Adrian, we cannot hear you. I don't know if you started speaking.
I think you're on mute right now.
Unmute. Now I'm mute. Now it should be okay, right?
Yes, but we don't
Yeah.
see your presentation though. We see your you see your Firefox screen.
Okay, so now how do you?
Yeah, done. No, just we were fine. We're there. Okay.
Do you see my presentation?
We see your presentation and really hear you, so we're good.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Claudia, for the invitation. It's great to be here with this terrific panel. As you mentioned, I want to talk about a Bayesian approach to projecting, to actually population projections with migration uncertainty. So this will focus on just one of the areas that Jakub mentioned. And I will say that a lot of this work is in collaboration with the United Nations Population Division. So in a certain sense, although we're not, of course, representing the UN, I think that's the kind of the overall focus that we have at the moment. So just some things about projecting international migration. I think as certainly was underlying Guy's presentation, the context where we have here is that past data on international migration is poor for most countries, and that's really dominant, the dominant fact. So the UN and many other agencies, for projections, they project net international migration, which is immigration minus emigration. And one reason for that is that the data are better, in a sense, that estimates of net migration, which come from residual method, they're often better than estimates of in-migration or out-migration, or the bilateral flows that Guy was talking about, where a lot of progress is being made. And also a second slightly lucky thing is that projections of net migration are really enough for population projections, at least in a fairly narrow sense. Of course, they're far from perfect. Again, as I think Jakub mentioned, and we have the famous Rogers Requiem from some decades ago that pointed out difficulties with it, including possible incompatibilities between age structure of immigration and emigration. To some extent, these are alleviated by the very condensed age structure of international migration. So to first order, everybody who migrates internationally is between 18 and let's say 35, and they're young children. So there's always a balance between data quality, which really drives a lot of the story, and then the analytic optimality that we'd like, but usually can't achieve. So what the UN currently does is mostly assumes that net international migration is constant in each country up to 2050, and then moves slowly towards zero. And this is adjusted so that migration sums to zero across the world. And a big issue with this is it's deterministic. As Jakub was emphasizing, there's a great deal of uncertainty about migration, and this isn't accounted for in UN projections and most other national projections, even though it's a very important part of overall uncertainty. And the UN now does take account of uncertainty in fertility and mortality. So what we're proposing is a Bayesian hierarchical model for net international migration rates. And what we do is we model the net international migration rate denoted by R sub CT in country C at time period T by a stochastic process model, a statistical model called an autoregressive time series model, which looks like this. It basically says that the migration rate fluctuates in time around a long-term mean for a country called mu C. And is autocorrelated from one time period to another. There isn't really enough data to estimate the model reliably in each country by itself. We've only, the UN works in 5-year time periods, and there are only 14 time periods with data of any kind. So the solution is for each country to draw on information from other countries. And the method is a Bayesian hierarchical model estimated by a method called Markov chain Monte Carlo, or MCMC. And this gives a sample of many future possible trajectories of net migration for all countries and periods. So many scenarios, possibly thousands of future scenarios. And these are converted to age-specific rates using past data or model migration schedules. So what does this give for Mexico? So here we have basically we have the historic net migration for Mexico, and this is a rate per thousand people in a 5-year period, and we see it's been out migration since 1950, and the UN current projection is just to say the future will be the same as the present, essentially. The probabilistic migration says there's a lot of uncertainty, that this is the whole this whole orange area here, that actually it'll probably continue to be out migration, but there could actually be net in migration, and a lot more uncertainty than the UN currently allows for. Here we've got the same thing, but with numbers of migrants, I believe in millions per 5-year period. It's the same story. And what does this say about population? Well, in blue we have the current UN projection with confidence intervals in blue, and then in red and the pink area, we have the probabilistic projection allowing for uncertainty in migration. And we see there's a lot more uncertainty about future population. And we see a lower population future for Mexico, peaking in the median around 150 million in 2050, and then starting to decline due to the combination of both likely but not certain continued outmigration and declining fertility. So one interesting thing is, how important is migration for the uncertainty in future populations? And I don't have a number for Mexico here, but if you look at the world, we find almost nothing, because it's just 2% of total variance. And that's not surprising, because migration doesn't, nobody immigrates or emigrates to the world as a whole. If we look at Africa, we see it's a low fraction. It's only about 11% of the variation is due to migration. And that's not surprising. A lot of high fertility countries in Africa, and a lot of the uncertainty is due to the fact we don't know exactly what fertility will be in the future. If we look at Germany, though, 3/4 of the variance is due to migration. And that is the case for many countries, both developed and developing, where migration is a big part of the story. So the balance is due to fertility and mortality. So now we're in a situation where actually, in terms of demography, in the sense of forecasting future population, migration is by far the most important component for many countries. My guess is that's true of Mexico as well. Could this method be improved? So The biggest improvement would be to get better data on past migration, and Guy was talking about that. Use covariates. Jakub made the point that these are hard to predict into the future, and in fact we tried to do experiments with this which didn't work very well. So I'd be skeptical about the potential of this. A third approach would be to use between country migration flows rather than net migration, and again Guy was kind of hinting at that possibility. It's difficult, of course, because the data, although they're improving, they're still not good. And this is recapping Guy's talk that these methods do have potential for better data, which could lead to forecasts along these areas. There are similar issues if we say, okay, let's break it down by just immigration and emigration without looking at the particular countries these are from or to. And again, the data are probably less good than net migration. One interesting thing is that we have a good handle, although for most migration flows, we don't know, the data are poor. For refugee migration, they're a lot better. So separating out the refugee migration would seem like a good idea. But forecasting future refugee movements, of course, would be very challenging. So finally, to kind of summarize, we're proposing a Bayesian hierarchical model for net international migration, which the UN is considering now for use in its future population projections for all countries in the world population prospects. And this yields probabilistic population projections with migration uncertainty. It did well in various validation experiments. Migration is now the largest source of uncertainty about future population for many countries. Improvements to the method are possible, but especially what's needed is better data. And here's just a few references and a website. The last one is actually the paper that Guy gave his talk about. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thanks for the patience with the technical issues. I want to say just highlight two things. One, that I love how you summarize all the possible improvements for the method, and I guess we just need to keep trying and try different things because there is no one solution. Right? I mean, adding covariates will not make things better, or considering flows. I mean, we need to consider all the different challenges. And I'm going to ask you later, but I'm going to give you a hint on some of the questions that I will ask you later to talk about emigration, return, and transit migration, because you also have a great paper from 2019. And I think it's interesting that you talked here about refugee flows and other migrant flows, but everything gets complicated when you start thinking on transit and return really into the picture. So thank you so much. Let's move to Helena Cruz Castanheira, and this links very well with what you were mentioning from the role of the UN and the possible changes that the UN can implement in the future. So Helena Cruz Castanheira is a Population Affairs Officer at the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, CLAC or CEPAL in Spanish, at the United Nations. She's in CELADE, the Centro Latinoamericano y Caribeño de Demografía, based in Chile, and prior to CLAC, she was a consultant for the World Bank, UNICEF, and the UN Population Division. It would be really interesting, Helena, to listen what's the perspective of these issues from the UN. I hope you can share the screen and everything is set up now.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I don't have PowerPoint, so I'll be talking.
Great.
First of all, yeah, good morning and afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone. I thank you, Colmex, very much for the opportunity to be here. It's really a great pleasure. It's a very important center for demography and demography research in the region, and very good training in demography and statistics. So I really congratulate that. I'm talking from Santiago. I work in CELADE, as Claudia mentioned, the population division of UN CLAC. We work directly with the UN WPP estimates and projections for the region. And I'm really glad that Adrian has explained the current UN methodology and the methodological research involved for the future. We usually work very close with migration estimates. So as you know, WPP has it's a product that has a time separates estimates from projections. So the estimates are from 1950 until 2020 for the WP 2019 revision, and 2020 to 2100. And so doing this estimates part from 1950 to 2020, it's not trivial. It's really the migration part. It's a big challenge. The component that we have less observed data about it, and so my talk here is really a call for better migration data in the region, because there is no good projection if we don't know our past and our present, right? So, and the models and the efforts made methodologically for projection, I think that it's really important also that the uncertainty reflects the uncertainty in the data as well. So the future of migration, we really need the information on migration flows by age and sex, and also more information on the reasons that people migrate and the changes in policies, because migration is a component also it's very influenced by policies, right? So it's very important to keep researching the topic and trying to understand more what are the dynamics in the region. And to illustrate it a little bit more, one of the most fundamental equations in social sciences is the balance equation, right? So we have the population times T is equal to population times 0 plus births minus deaths, plus or minus the net migration, depending if it's positive or negative. So in a region where we have the births data are not complete, we don't have a strong CRVS data, and also and census, they can have problems with under-enumeration as well. So and this is for the region, but for most countries in the world, we have this error of closure of this balance equation, right? So, and it's very difficult that when we put real data in this equation, so we have population times T, population times 0, plus births minus deaths, and the net migration. If we put data, it's very difficult that we actually find the population time T if we have a census in time T, so that everything is going to match. And so this is the called error of closure. So the migration, unfortunately, because it's the component that we have less data about, it's usually used to close this balance equation, right, with the residual. So it's called the residual migration estimate. So with the administrative registers, now some countries are doing very good progress to have and use administrative registers of entries and exits, and this requires well, first legal, and it is usually done at the frontier. So this is for regular migration only, but even regular migration, it's very hard to measure, right? So now some countries like Colombia have started, have new developments and methodologies to try to really measure, to accompany the same person, entry and exit, and try to get a migration estimate based on that. So it's really a challenge, and now census has been always a fundamental data and information to have information from other regions. But now, what is happening for other countries and to get the flow in the region, right? But now with the COVID-19 pandemic, we Many census got delayed significantly. Fundings are being cut. Mexico was able to do their census in 2020, and it's really great for the region that they could do it before the pandemic. But we are seeing lots of possible cuts in funding, and really worry about the census situation. So maybe data, at least for this next revision of the OPP, we are gonna have less census information than we would expect, and that's gonna be very difficult to estimate without census information. So for more than 12 years in some countries, like this last census 2010. And so it's, and with the pandemic, so the UN has this Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, really a huge call for respecting the human rights and improving data collection and to make decisions based on data collection, and the free of flow between countries and regions, and the flow intra-regional from Latin America has increased a lot too. And so with the economic recessions of the COVID-19, we see greater disrespect for this global compact, for what was accorded, because there is an increase of xenophobia, deportations in countries, and more resistance against migration. So we also need to think what's gonna happen also with this informal migration flows and formal. So it's a very complex situation. The estimates of population is really, we get the data and we have a dark room, the true value in the middle, and we try to get from different windows the best that we can to the reality to make this estimate. But it's when we don't have no window to look at, it's really hard to infer what is going on. So yeah, that's really my thought, like this call to improve data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helena. And yeah, thank you for bringing up COVID and all of the challenges in terms of data. I think we're gonna be focusing that further. Let's move to Victor García Guerrero. He's an associate professor at here at home at the Center for Demographic, Urban, and Environmental Studies at Colmex. He has been advisor and consultant on demographic methods for the United Nations Population Fund, the National Population Council of Mexico. He participated in the last official population projections team, and he has worked in other consulting tasks. His research interests are mathematical demography, applied demography, population estimates, and all of the issues that we've been talking here. So, and he's in charge of the demographic dimension of the project on migration policy and foreign policy. Within this project, we are 9 researchers from Colmex, and we're really interested. He's going to be talking, of course, about a little bit more in detail what happens in Mexico, but to try to put in context all of these challenges that we are actually finding. So, Victor, I hope you can share your screen and everything's ready with the technology.
Yes, I think so.
Thanks, Victor.
Thank you very much, Claudia. And it's a very real honor to share this panel with colleagues that I really admire and respect. I'm going to talk about all the challenges that we are going to face after COVID-19, mainly thinking in how to project migration. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, but can you make it full screen so that we don't see all the...
Good.
Well, thanks, great.
Thank you. So, as all you said, international migration is the most uncertain variable in the demographic dynamic. But during the pandemic, we focus on mortality and the uncertainty around it. But at the end of the day, migration has increased its uncertainty, and in the future, it could increase more and more. So, yeah, as all we know, it's very hard to measure and to project migration normally, or say in normal periods. But after pandemic, we really don't know how to do it properly. So the importance of demographic estimates and projections in Mexico is very high, because we need for decision making at governmental and private sectors. So at the end of the day, the migration is not working, or is not used as an asset to communicate the future of migration. It is used only operationality as Helena said, in the balance, in the demographic balance equation, just to get the total population. So to have it, we need, or we use the estimates and all our demographic information from censuses, surveys, and vital statistics produced mainly by the National Statistic Institute. And they are used to assess. Now we are going to use it to assess the census undercount in absence of post-enumeration survey. But at the end of the day, the population projections just indicate what demographic dynamics will be if determined economical, social, political, and epidemiological circumstances occur. So as Helena said, Mexico is one of the few countries in the world that carry out its 2020 census. We really don't know if it is good or bad for us, because it was finished just at the very beginning of the pandemic. So we don't know really what is going to happen during the pandemic period. So, and we really don't know if we are ready to calculate estimates, what we call demographic conciliation, because we have a delay in publication of vital statistics, 1 year at least. And now there are some information that perhaps the vital statistics or the civil registers of births and deaths will be more hit or more impacted by the pandemic, because usually there is a high undercount of births, but now with the pandemic, perhaps this undercount will be higher. So we really don't know until the vital statistics will be published. The 2020 census is used for immigration, to measure immigration mainly, and we have to wait until the American Community Survey released in October 2021, because it is the main source of information to measure out migration. So we can have a very good estimates for out migration, but we really don't know what will happen about immigration during this period of pandemic. And we were thinking on another strategy to forecast the total population, because the census data is close to the beginning of 2020. We could do the historical reconstruction until 2019, and we have to wait, or we plan to wait until 2020 or 2021 to start the jump-off year of the projection. We need to wait until vital statistics of mortality and fertility will be published to assess with high reliability the real excess of mortality and the possible decrease of fertility, in order to decide which method to use and what assumptions to make. So these are the comparison of the age structure that we got with the projection, the last projection after the intercensal survey, and this is the age structure of that we got after the 2020 census. So we got a very good estimate or projection of the total population. And we were very proud of using hybrid methods in the last population projections, in the sense that we forecasted probabilistically each demographic component using some variants of the Lee-Carter method, and the total population by age and sex was projected deterministically using the traditional cohort component method and just taking the medians of each component. Because at the end of the day, what the state needs is an exact or a single number for in order to put all this to make all this decision making. So at subnational level, internal migration was forecasted deterministically. So these are the numbers, and we forecasted migration separately, as Adrian said. For one side, we projected out migration, and for another side, we projected immigration. And it was a quite complex model. You can see here how high, how broad is the prediction intervals, taking into account the ages. So what challenges we face or we are thinking on after COVID-19 and for the next population projections, mainly is the data. What about the quality of administrative registries? Because our time series is quite long, but we need, to make a lot of demographic analysis and estimates in order to have a very good and smooth time series for each demographic variable in order to have reliable projections. But after the pandemic period, we really don't know what about the quality of the vital statistics. Which methodologies we can use? We really don't know, because we were very proud on using these probabilistic methods, because I think that Mexico is the second country in Latin America using this kind of hybrid methodologies after Costa Rica, I guess. But now we really don't know if we have to move back to deterministic methodologies or I don't know, perhaps using Bayesian approaches in order to have or to measure properly the uncertainty around our demographic variables. And what assumptions we need to do, because after the pandemic period, we don't know what will happen with mortality and its size effects. Perhaps there will be some cohort effects in the future. We really don't know what will happen with fertility, if there is coming a baby boom or a baby burst in the future, and mainly what will happen with migration, because we really don't know if there is in the corner a next global economical recession, or perhaps there will be an economic recovery, and with this economic recovery, the potential migrants could have the resources to start or to continue the migration plans. So these are all my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thanks for setting up all of the challenges, especially in relation to migration and the other demographic components. And as you said, we are not ready to use the 2020 census right now for population projections. Let's move to Frank Laczko. I hope we are fine with the connection with him. He's the director of the IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin. He was previously based in Geneva, where he led the IOM's Migration Research Division. And he's the co-chair of the Data and Research Group of the Global Migration Group. It's a pleasure to have Frank to discuss all of the issues surrounding data and how the IOM is actually working during the pandemic, but also in the past, to actually provide better data for migration. So I guess, Frank, if we can go with you, I don't know if you are able.
Yes, can you hear me, Claudia? Can you hear me?
And we're sorry
Very
we
good.
cannot see you, I think.
Well, that's okay. So as long as you can hear me, this can be like a podcast, all right?
We can hear you.
Or listening to the radio. And if you really want to look for an image of me, I'm sure you can find one online. So
thanks, Frank.
It's always very difficult to be the last speaker because all the other speakers have made great points. But let me start off by saying that it's a great pleasure to be involved in an event which is being organized from Mexico, because maybe you don't know this, but the International Forum on Migration Statistics, which is organized every 2 years by IOM, UNDESA, and OECD, is interested in organizing the next Global Forum on Migration Statistics in Mexico next year. And discussions are still underway, so this is a secret, so please don't tell anyone yet. But if things work out, we are hoping that we will see you perhaps in person next year in Mexico. So look, let me try and give you a perspective from a policy perspective on some of the things we've heard, and also tell you a little bit about what's happening in IOM and also the UN. Number one, sitting in Germany, I can say that policymakers in Europe and in Germany in particular are extremely interested in forecasting migration, understanding future migration trends. Tomorrow, I have a discussion with the Ministry of Interior on this subject. 2 weeks ago, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wanted to have a discussion on this subject. More than 10 countries in Europe have plans and models which involve trying to forecast migration. From the perspective of a policymaker, however, it's quite challenging to make sense of Jakub's last slide. First of all, there is so much information out there, so many different reports using different techniques and approaches. Secondly, there is a lot of jargon in this field. We talk about projections, early warning, scenarios, migration forecasts, etc., etc. And as you all know, you're all the experts, you know there are different techniques involved, different data sources, different assumptions. Now, all of these things are not always fully made clear, I think, when presenting some of this information to policymakers. But the biggest challenge, and I want to underline what the last two speakers have said, is COVID-19, the global pandemic. Because this has had a devastating effect on global mobility patterns around the world. And we don't know yet how we're going to emerge from this pandemic and how it's going to affect the future of migration. And a lot of the forecasting work was done obviously before the pandemic and did not in any way predict the pandemic. This is what is euphemistically called by Jakub and others one of these black swans. I don't know why we call them black swans, but anyway, it was something that nobody really predicted, but it has probably had the biggest effect on global migration than anything we could imagine. So not only has it affected mobility today, but it's likely to affect mobility patterns in the future. We've written about this at IOM, and it has many different effects. You know about the effects on remittances, the loss of jobs, stranded migrants, the increase in return of migrants, increased xenophobia and attacks on migrants, and higher infection rates among migrants in many parts of the world. So it has had huge impact. So the demand for data on migration, it has been increasing during this pandemic, but at the same time, our capacity to collect data on migration using traditional methods has actually diminished, as a number of the speakers have mentioned, and as the World Bank and UN Statistics Division have documented in 3 global surveys of national statistical offices around the world. More and more countries are either postponing their censuses and surveys or cancelling them outright. So this is a very, very challenging context. But at the same time, the global pandemic has demonstrated the potential of one data source, and maybe here I can actually offer a new point, something that hasn't been said already, which is data innovation. COVID-19 has made everyone much more aware of the possibilities of new technologies, particularly for, tracking mobility. And one of the things that governments are increasingly looking at, particularly in Europe, is the potential of using non-traditional data sources. Only last week, the European Migration Network organized an entire conference on artificial intelligence and migration. The European Union recently passed legislation proposed to pass legislation specifically on this topic. And we at IOM have created something called the Big Data for Migration Alliance with the European Commission, which brings together a lot of experts in this field and tries to promote dialogue between the public and private sectors to explore whether policymakers can access and leverage this data. There are many challenges, and I understand that in the next part of this conversation, we will talk about some of those challenges. Let me just give you a sense of what IOM has been doing in this area. One thing that has not been documented yet is that we have revived discussions about a world migration survey with colleagues in your region, in Argentina and in other parts of in Europe. So you may know that the IUSSP has also expressed more interest in this idea of, the idea of having a world migration survey has existed for many, many years, but nobody's actually done anything about to try and move forward this idea. So what we have done recently is we've worked with the African Union. They have called for an Africa migration survey to be launched in Africa, where data on migration is particularly limited. And we're now proposing to conduct a pilot survey in 2 African countries to explore the potential of developing a Africa-wide migration survey and potentially a world migration survey if there is an appetite and resources for such a survey in the future. We're also looking at developing migration modules which can be included in existing surveys. As far as forecasting work is concerned, let me mention 4 things that we've been doing. Number 1, we've been analyzing the Gallup World Poll data, where people are asked about their migration intentions and how far they're actually taking concrete steps to prepare for migration. This is a survey of more than 150 countries dating back from 2008. Secondly, we've carried out surveys with experts in Europe. Pre-COVID, we contacted 178 experts and asked them to assess 4 possible migration scenarios for the future. I think one of the take-home messages from this kind of exercise is that even the experts find it difficult to agree on very much. So it's difficult to then use this information to advise policymakers. We also have a global migration data portal, which has a huge number of resources relating to migration forecasting, and organized last September with the European Migration Network, a whole conference on migration forecasting. And there is a report available from January of this year in the special issue of Migration Policy Practice. Just the last word from me. if you look at the most recent report on forecasting in Germany, you see that the estimates for net migration, I think for the next 20 years, vary from minus 1.5 million to plus 6 million. And this again is an example of, you know, why it's quite difficult for policymakers to know how best to interpret all this information that is being produced, which relates to projections, forecasts, and the future of migration. I don't have time to mention fully one important thing that happened in March of this year, which is also going to affect the way in which we think about the future of migration. The UN has proposed a new conceptual framework for measuring migration, and it has been trying to encourage countries since 1954 to develop the same approach to collecting data on migration, somewhat unsuccessfully. But this new conceptual framework may also have some impact on the way in which countries collect data on migration in the future. So I'll stop there. By the way, I didn't prepare a PowerPoint because you told us not to. So I always follow the instructions of the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. Well, the PowerPoint was completely optional. Thanks for putting all these points, and we will not tell anyone that you're interested in having this International Forum on Migration Statistics in Mexico, and I think it would be an honor after Paris and Cairo to hold this meeting. We hope that it works out. I mean, Victor and I and some other colleagues from Mexico were in Paris at the beginning of the forum, and I think it was really clear that we need better data for studying migration. And so I think that having a joint effort of different institutions looking at this at the global level is very, very important. I want to be a little bit flexible with the format that we had prepared because we are late. We had lots of technical issues. We started a few minutes late. And so I'm going to start already with some of the questions of the public that they're putting in the chat, as well as some of the questions that I have. And I'm going to be a little bit flexible in this, and I really invite everyone to answer very succinctly, although I know that we have lots of different challenges. I'm really interested in understanding how we can better project migration, considering uncertainty, but around irregular migration flows, increasing times for transit migration, changes in patterns of circular and return migration, but also a potential unexpected increase on forced migration. So I will ask anyone in the panel if they're interested in trying to understand what these changes in transit migration and return mean. And as I said, I mean, Adrian has a paper on that, but if anyone else can pop up also, please do so. Adrian. We can't
mute
hear
myself.
you.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much. I think again, you know, I think what we're hearing from all the panelists, and correctly, is, you know, that the difficulties of data, the data generally are poor, and certainly, I mean, the UN in its reports on migration, they focus on migration stocks, the number of people, you know, foreign-born people in a country, because they really didn't feel they had enough information to talk about migration flows. And I think Guy's presentation, he talked about you know, the new methods, and he kind of kindly sort of did feature the method we're involved with, which you also mentioned in PNS paper, about estimating bilateral flows between pairs of countries. And I think for the first time we were able to get, you know, a first handle on what these actually are. And one of the things which has been, I think, almost impossible to get a handle on before is return migration flows and transit migration flows, where people go from, you know, their country of birth to another country and then on to a third country. And I think maybe one of the surprises, and it's not actually in our paper explicitly as a number, but it can be deduced, is that about 45% of migrants end up returning home at some point in time. So, and I think that's more than would have been thought. And, you know, transit migration, I think, is which involves, you know, 3 countries, is about 10% of you know, world migration totally, total kind of order of magnitude. So I think these are very important. Aspects, and I think that getting a handle on the data for these will be extremely important for projections, because, you know, we can project migration, but then if a lot of people are coming back, as it seems, you know, our paper seems to suggest more people are actually eventually returning home than was thought. And net migration it's in a certain sense the most reliable data we have, but it doesn't really tell us anything about return migration. It just says, you know, there were this many more people coming in than going out. So whereas, you know, how many of the people who migrate actually end up returning is, I think, quite an important aspect of the story.
Please.
I think one of the ideas that was already mentioned in today's discussion would be also to look into different flows separately and sort of disentangling inflows, outflows, return migration, because all of these will have different properties, and it will be easier to actually look at them individually. And this is something that also makes sense in the context of forward-looking investigations into what might happen after COVID, what may happen to migration as a result of COVID, and the changing patterns of mobility, the changing patterns of work. You know, this is a discussion that goes back to all the way to the 1970s to Wilbur Zelinsky and the mobility transition, right? The bifurcation of mobility patterns and substitutability with communication. We are exactly at that point. So what we can gain by looking at different flows separately is that different groups of migrants will be affected by the post-COVID changes to a different degree. So you can imagine that, you know, for family migration or asylum migration, the whole, you know, COVID-induced proliferation of remote working won't be as important as it will be for economic migrants. And another point on return migration, I think return migration, probably alongside with family migration, can be actually these can be the flows where there can be quite a few gains in terms of predictability, because if you think about it, right, the population at risk of return migrating, likewise, the population at risk of family migrating is quite well defined, as opposed to other groups of migrants, right? Only those who have already migrated can return, and only those who have family abroad can move as family migrants. So there is, you know, there are differences in predictability, and I think that's quite a nice way also for sort of future methodological advancements in this area.
Thank you. And you were actually already mentioning some of the questions, I mean, that actually dealt with the role of different types of flows. There's a question on the effect of climate change, and I'm really wondering if, I mean, I know that Guy has done some work on that, but I don't know if you could respond. What is the role of climate change, and how is this considered in population projections?
Yeah, maybe I can offer a few words on what we do at YASA. That is where we try and develop scenarios essentially based on long-run migration projections, and we try and get them to match the SSP, the social pathways. And these are sort of a set of world futures, not just migration, sort of about how well countries are collaborating or not collaborating, if there's regional rivalries, and the impacts of climate change, how they fit through. These SSP sort of pathways have been mapped out in many different variables, economic variables, climate variables, and so we try to develop the migration scenarios to sort of fit into these pathways, which have these different climate futures. Try and reflect on that.
Adrian, you wanted to add something?
I just say I think it's very important when thinking about climate change to make a big distinction between international migration and internal migration. I think that possibly that climate change, maybe its likely impact on international migration may be in some cases overstated. I think it's obviously going to be very important for small island countries that might get flooded out, but they total maybe a small 3-4 million people in the world. Also, within most climate change migration, or the indication so far is it'll be internal migration, and perhaps among big countries, the country most likely to be impacted by to have international migration, climate driven, is Bangladesh, because it's a lot of it is low lying and subject to maybe very massive flooding. But I think what we've seen so far is that when there are climate events and people have to migrate, they migrate internally. So the biggest climate event in the United States so far was probably Hurricane Katrina. Lots of people migrated. All of New Orleans was evacuated. Certainly hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million people migrated. But they didn't go to Mexico or Chile. They went to Mississippi and Texas and so on from Louisiana. And similarly, I think we see that elsewhere. So I think for internal migration, climate change is likely to be very, very large and important. For international migration, it's likely to be much more, important for certain countries, but probably less of an overall feature.
Jakub.
Yeah, there's the question about climate change is very important, because the thing with climate change is that it is something that is and will be acting across a range of time horizons. So we'll have climatic events like Hurricane Katrina that Adrian has just mentioned, and then we'll have the long range changes like the increase, the rise of the sea levels. So what we are really looking in statistical parlance is we're looking at change at different frequency of data as well as processes that we are looking at, and that goes also back to Frank Laczko's point about non-traditional data sources. So the discussion around looking into digital traces or similar data, mobile phone data, this is very much concentrated on the short term end of the prediction spectrum, right? So this is something that will be extremely helpful to map the situation as it unfolds, right? But still it doesn't help us resolve, given the time granularity of these data sources, it doesn't help us resolve the very long range strategic level scenario planning that we also need to make in the context of climate change.
Thank you to both. And there's actually a question from Tanya from Barona asking actually about whether or not it's possible that big data will improve the forecasting of migration. So I guess, can big data help us?
Can I say something?
First, Frank. Yes, Frank.
Yes. Yeah. Well, some of my colleagues have been looking at this, and there's been work by, I think, several researchers looking at techniques like Google searches, and apparently the migration field is well behind other fields in the social sciences when it comes to exploring non-traditional data sources. I mean, the UN set up something called the Global Pulse several years ago to help them leverage big data to understand development trends. And there are mixed results from analyzing these different sources of information. We have a blog that we just produced, which looked at certain corridors around the world, and there are some good correlations. So basically, this is looking at when people start putting in search terms in Google and start looking for I want to go to Mexico, and I'm planning to migrate to Mexico from country X or whatever, and you can analyze this sort of information, and sometimes it produces interesting results. And for example, in the case of, I think, Syrians going to Sweden, we saw interesting correlations, less so when we looked at Korea and China and other parts of the world. So it's certainly something that I think will become increasingly important. And then there are also people using Facebook and artificial intelligence, etc. I mean, one thing that we obviously need to keep in mind is that there is still a digital divide around the world, even if there are, I think, 1 billion people who are using Google. That's by no means the majority of the planet. And similarly, even though we have 2.7 billion people on Facebook, that's also not the majority of the people in the world. So, you know, there are lots of questions about the representativeness of such data, how you access such data, and also the concepts that are used, because Facebook, for example, counts, I think, 271 million expats, but is an expat the same as a migrant as defined by the UN Statistics Division? So there are all these sorts of things that you have to keep in mind. But I think from the perspective of the UN Expert Group on Migration Statistics, which brings together more than 20 countries from around the world and most of the UN agencies working on migration statistics, I think there's a lack of dialogue with the private sector and a lack of dialogue between national statistical offices and the private sector to at least explore the potential of using such information and data sources. There's a new initiative started at Eurostat, but it's not focused on migration per se. And then, of course, there are lots of concerns about data protection and risks to migrants and other groups. Should some of this information you know, compromise people's security? But I mean, although we recognize the risks and the opportunities, you at least have to be in the same room or in a virtual room talking to people if you're going to you know, leverage or use this information. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, we've just produced new conceptual guidelines on migration and mobility, and we had no discussion at all with the private sector, as far as I'm aware. Anyway.
Thanks, Frank. Helena.
Claudia, I would like to use this opportunity to mention that for official statistics, in order to use big data, we already have a challenge to use administrative registers altogether to organize it. So there is a lack of institutional capacity, technological and analytical, how to analyze the data. So we can't ignore this demand of, okay, let's we have this digital divide, but to work with big data, we need a lot of hard drive spaces and technology that are on the verge. They are starting to be produced. So the academia is starting to look at this data, starting to look at this methodology. And so for it to get incorporated in the official statistics, I think it needs to be much more developed. And also we need to develop the institutions in order to use big data, but also the administrative registers and how to use it better. And so it's really a technological demand and analytical demand, and also the articulation across institutions, not only with the private sector, but also across the same government institutions, and how to share data. And so there is a big need for that, for developing this at the government level. And yeah.
Thank you for highlighting the need for dialogue. I mean, widely, right? I mean, not only between scholars, between offices, but like really a wide dialogue. I think Jakub wants to say something. Go on.
I think just to follow up on both what Helena and Frank said, the problem with some of the big data is the lack of transparency, and transparency is one of the key tenets of official statistics, right? What we want to publish in the realm of official statistics, we want to be as transparent and well documented as it could be. And Frank gave an example of Facebook data and the definition of an expat, which no one knows who it is and how the algorithm really calculates the number of such people, because the algorithm is proprietary. And moreover, my PhD student Francesco Rampazzo discovered by looking at Facebook data that this definition is periodically reviewed. So if you look at trends of expats on Facebook over time, you'll see jumps every mid-March. Which doesn't help when you try to analyze these trends, and even less so if you try to look at anything in 2020, because mid-March something of global significance happened in mid-March 2020, which seems to be conflated now with the change of the definition on Facebook. So there are quite a few problems that we'll need to tackle. In official statistics, there are areas where big data are doing great jobs. So price indices with web scrapers, this is brilliant work. But for migration, I think we still have quite a lot of work to do.
Now let me put a question here. So we know that, we agree migration is uncertain. Fertility and mortality are better to measure. So should we keep as we are, assuming that things will continue as in the past? I know that it's a provocative question because you already said that we should not. But what should we do in terms of trying to grasp uncertainty today within the pandemic and within the interaction of changes in demographic dynamics due to changes in fertility and mortality, right? So do we need to keep something constant?
Well, if I could say something, can you hear me, Claudia?
Yes, we can.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, if I could pick up on a point which was made by the speaker in Santiago, it is the importance of exploring administrative data and making better use of the data that is already collected by governments around the world, often for different purposes, but it isn't fully analyzed or shared for migration purposes currently. And, there is an example from the UN Statistics Division itself. The majority of countries in the world do not provide data on migration flows to the UN Statistics Division. I think it's around 44, 45 countries that are able to do that at the moment. One recommend, of course, we need to invest in, new data collection, explore new data sources, but we also need to make better use of the information which is currently available and which will always be collected, because every time you come and, live somewhere or work somewhere, there's some administrative procedure. Now, the big challenge is going to be more irregular migration. And one thing we've seen through the pandemic is that irregular migration flows have definitely not stopped. And we in IOM GIMDAC in Berlin also collect data on missing migrants around the world, including in your part of the world. And unfortunately, we are recording in some parts of the world more deaths than ever before. Yeah, that's also something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
Adrian.
Yeah, I think one thing that's important in terms of getting a handle on where things are and potentially where they're going is that the data sources they're all bad in some sense, but they can all contribute something. So, and it's not fully clear which sources can contribute which, but I think there's a sense in which a very important challenge is combining the different data sources and using all their strengths. I think, for example, the big data, it's early days for big data in migration, but I think the potential is terrific. Emilio Zagini's group in Rostock is really, I think, leading the way in terms of using and showing the potential of big data, but it has a lot of weaknesses, and particularly it has biases due to the fact that some people use big data or use social media or whatever, other people don't. So Emilio says, you know, big data, big bias, and a big challenge is adjusting for that, correcting for it, and taking account of the uncertainty. So I think that that's really how to combine the different data sources, rather than saying, you know, there's this big data will save us, and this I don't think it will, but I think it may contribute something. I think Helena's comment is very good about administrative data. We need to combine all of these. One area where I think big data may be very useful is in short-term tracking of unusual events, so big refugee events, for example. And I did hear that the UN was using cell phone data to get a handle on the migration from Venezuela into neighboring countries, the recent one. And Helena, I think, may have actually been involved with that. So I'd kind of like to ask her if she has any any knowledge of that, because it sounded really a fascinating use of these data sources.
I think you were totally right, Adrian. We need to look, it's like I said, it's a closed room, a dark room, and we don't have any information. So we need to look at all the information we have to try to get to the best or more close to reality estimate that we can, right? And so it's really like surprising to see how not evolve the way we are in use administrative registers as we could, because as it has been mentioned by Frank Laczko, that it's data that is there, it's being produced every day, and we are not analyzing it as we could and getting the best of the data. But so there is a lot of potential for data development and collection, and I'm very glad with the word migration survey also that they are pushing, and I hope we can do it. And the more information we have, the best we will know the past and the present and the future. And it's very important for academics and scholars to try to analyze and use this data, and we got the whole in the front of expanding the technological frontier of how to use this data and how to estimate migration, so that we can look and inform in order to produce the estimates that we need, right? So it's really good.
Thank you. Let me put another question. So are we living in a migration crisis or in a data crisis? Victor, no.
Thank you.
Hello.
I really don't know,
Yeah.
because we have been living in a data crisis, specifically about migration since ever. So yeah, we had to use a lot of information, as Adrian, Jakub, and Frank said, and Helena said, that we need to put all this information from many sources together in order to understand one of the demographic variables. So we can use vital statistics, some of the questions of the vital statistics, in order to understand, for example, the return migration, if the question is put in the vital register. So yeah, we really don't know. I was thinking in the figure, in the graph that Adrian showed, in this peak that Mexico had at the beginning of the 21st century, and I remember that talking with the demographers who were in charge of the demographic projections in that time, they told me that they didn't know how to forecast migration, because their only issue was to project total population. not to forecast migration. So they only used the constant rates for immigration, out-migration in order to produce the total migration, the total population by age and sex. And it's funny because these are some of the more precise, to say something, projections that we have. When we compare these projections, the 2000 projections, with the intercensal survey, with the census 2010 and 2020, they are quite, they don't have too high error. So how to do it? We don't know, but it works to keep the rates constant in order to produce total population, not to forecast migration, but only to produce that. So yeah, we don't know what kind of crisis we have, but at the end of the day, we need to be quite creative in order to jump these kind of adversities. Jakub, I think Jakub wanted to say something.
Thanks, Victor. So, yes, your question, Claudia, was is it data crisis or migration crisis? And my question is it not just reality, right? Migration is so messy when it comes to the processes, to the data, and we just have to live with it and accept that uncertainty is fact of life. Where we can do better is sort of, I go back to Frank's initial intervention, is the communication, right? The communication, especially between the sort of academic statisticians, demographers, then the world of official statistics, and then finally the policymakers. So the challenge is that we are looking at a very complex phenomena and processes, right? We need to keep them complex as long as we analyze them, but then somehow simplify the message, yet retain the key aspects for the decision makers to enable them to make the right decisions. I think that's probably what I would see as the main challenge here. And then, yeah, I'm not sure whether it's a crisis or not, but something to look to be done.
Yeah. If I could come in here, please, as well. Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think it's a data crisis. The problem is the data doesn't actually speak for itself. And people think somehow that, you just collect more and more data and you solve problems, but you don't. And it is very much about how you use the data and how you communicate, the information you have. And there are so many misperceptions about migration. And it's not the fault of the data as such, so we can't blame the data. In fact, we've probably got more data on mobility and migration than ever before. I mean, usually I see these reports now that talk about zettabytes and the number of zettabytes that are increasing all the time to illustrate the point that we're living in an age where probably there is the book which we're living in the age of migration data, probably more so than ever before, even if we're not living any more or less so in the age of mobility. And there's too much information and people's attention spans have been reduced, and we're not always sure what to do with all of this information and how to make sense of it all. So if there is a crisis, I think I agree with Jakub. I mean, the crisis is more the way we communicate and understand all of this information, and how we make a better job of doing this. And you see, for example, a lot of capacity building programs around the world that aim to support governments focus so much on improving data collection and not enough on building the capacity of policymakers to use the data and interpret the data. And I agree very strongly with the point about data integration. There are, pluses, there are advantages and disadvantages with all these different sources of information, and you try and make the best of what you can get your hands on and make sense of it. And there's no perfect solution, and we should recognize that.
Thank you, Frank. So I mean, you're the author of Europe's Migration Crisis, Making Sense of the Numbers. So I guess we do need to.
No,
really
it wasn't.
make sense of the
it wasn't that title.
Let me thank you for going over the time. I know that Guy is in China, it's really late. I just want to make a final round of comments from each of you in trying to, if we need to think about a recommendation or a scenario, how should we move forward? If you can please just like 1 minute try to summarize what COVID means, but also what new demographic dynamics means in trying to project migration and these challenges. How can we make sense of it? And I'm sure that this is the first dialogue of many, so hopefully we will have time. Let's start in the same order as the presentation. So please, Guy, if you wanna jump in and give a quick comment, a last comment.
Yeah, like a one. That's late. Maybe I guess the one thing thinking about projections that perhaps we could do as like migration experts feeding into population projections would be to create a baseline projection that's not as the UN does, which with this sort of convergence to zero in the very long run, but to actually use like a realistic migration scenario that happens now. I'd like to take either like a baseline period projections, keep net migration sort of constant as rather than having them converge to zero, or even take like a long run average of net migrations and keep that constant. I think this is something we're trying to do at YES, and I think it makes a lot more sense than like telling countries like Australia and the US that they always had immigration that it will tend to zero. It really creates an uneven balance and an unrealistic sort of world migration future system when that's carried out. Maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Guy. Jakub?
Yeah, so I think my message will be, don't be afraid of uncertainty, right? Embrace uncertainty, both as producers of migration estimates and predictions, as well as the users of migration estimates and predictions. I think that, and as we said just a moment before, improve the communication between the two. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. I guess the pandemic taught us everyone that uncertainty, we need to embrace it. Adrian.
Yeah, well, I'd come back to the data integration issue. I think one of the themes here is a paradox. There's as Frank said, there's more data about migration than ever before, and yet there's still huge uncertainty about what it is, and even more so about where it's going. And I think that there are a lot of different data sources around, and we can reduce that uncertainty substantially, I think, if these are integrated in a smart way. And I think methodologically, the COVID, there's been an extraordinary amount of science done in COVID, and quite a lot of that has been actually integrating different data sources about COVID, which has really, advanced that. And, there's most of the data about COVID is bad, but when you put it together, you get something that's kind of better than any one of the individual data sources. And I think migration maybe is something a bit similar. So that's, I think, for what we're doing here, trying to estimate and project, forecast migration, that may be the best, rather than looking for any one silver bullet, which I don't think exists.
Thank you, Adrian. I guess trust the data is also a message. Helena, please.
Yes, I just highlight that the importance of including uncertainty in the projection, the uncertainty of the data in the projection model, and communicating it really well. And also the importance of improving institutional capacity to organize the data, analyze it, and also the importance of training, right, of analysts and policymakers. And for the COMEX and universities keep up research on migration. It really enhances good information and helps us to understand the phenomenon.
Thank you, Helena, for recognizing the role that we have in academia as well for as demographers and population studies to get involved in these issues. Victor, please.
Yeah, well, not just following the ideas of Helena, is that now we are crossing by a very conjunctural period where the future is not so clear, and in order to produce better estimates and projections of each of the demographic variables, we need to to keep closer to another kind of specialist, another kind of scholars, as epidemiologists, as experts in family formation, experts in migration, in order to produce better projections. So it's not only the work of the demographer in charge of the projections. We need a transdisciplinary point of view in order to get better information and to control this uncertainty in a way. Thank you.
Thanks, Victor, for highlighting the role, the dialogue with others that are not only interested in migration, fertility, and mortality, right? Frank, please.
Okay, I think we can still be optimistic, and I'm going to give you 3 examples. First of all, from the UN. The UN is 70 years plus, and it last year launched, I think for the first time, an explicit UN-wide data strategy endorsed by the UN Secretary General. He came out with high-level statements saying we really need to value data and make the UN a data-driven organization. Secondly, last July, IOM, which is a little bit younger, 65 plus in years, also for the first time published an explicit migration data strategy for the UN's leading agency working in the field of migration. And again, it underlines the need for IOM to be much more of a data-driven organization and to work with member states, more than 170 countries around the world, to help them build their capacities to improve data on migration. Thirdly, only in the last few weeks, for the first time ever, the African Union, in partnership with IOM and OECD and Statistics Sweden, launched an Africa Migration Data Network, which is the first network in Africa that brings together both data producers and users from 53 countries in Africa. And we are currently working with our colleagues in other regions of the world to try and replicate this effort. So I think those are some examples for cause for optimism. And there's a lot of work ahead of us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you for ending on that optimistic note. I guess we all need a bunch of optimism. I'm really thankful for all of the panelists to staying here longer and bearing with us all the difficulties with technology, but we really appreciate. We hope you can come physically to Mexico at Colmex at some point when the pandemic allows us. But on behalf of all the team of the project, we're really thankful. This will be really useful for understanding how can we project migration in the future. And I mean, the recording will be available in the website of the seminar, and I guess I really hope that this is the first opportunity to dialogue on these issues from Colmex. I'm also thankful, and I'm going to switch to Spanish. Agradezco a todo el equipo de Cómputo por ayudarnos el día de hoy, a Isabel Gil, Fernando Arnávar, por el apoyo desde el Seminario de Migración Política, Desigualdad y Políticas Públicas, así como Cristina Portas y Tania Ochoa con la difusión del evento. Y Alberto, gracias por estar ahí presente en el apoyo logístico y técnico del día de hoy. We are really thankful, and I really hope you can stay in touch for the next dialogues on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Adiós, muchas gracias.
Thank you.
And good night to those who are late today, and good morning. Thank you, Guy, for staying up late.
Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Alberto, ¿puedes parar la transmisión? Ya. Creo que estuvo.
¿Ya se detuvo?
Sí, doctor, aquí estoy.
Sí.
Ya,
¿Sí estuvo ya se paró la transmisión?
ya está finalizada.
Ok, perfecto, gracias. Muchas gracias, Alberto.
Será.
Fernando, Isabel,
Hasta luego.
Víctor. Nos estamos viendo, corro.
Suerte, suerte. Salió muy bien.
Bye. Gracias.
Chao, chao.